We're very, very pleased today to have Kelly O'Shannessy with us. Kelly is the CEO, she'll be known to many of you, I'm imagining. She's the CEO of Australian Conservation Foundation, Australia's largest and national environment group. And before that, she was the CEO of Environment Victoria. Under Kelly's leadership, we've seen some amazing changes to protect the environment and to move climate change forward, climate action forward in Australia, including stopping the building of a new fire-powered station, ending commercial whaling in Australia, creating the Murray Darling Basin Plan, and being part of organising Australia's largest climate rally. And Kelly's going to be in conversation with Emma Hurd, and Kelly will introduce Emma. And we also have the privilege of having two other guest speakers with us today, Anna Skarkbeck and Patrick Suckling, and Kelly will introduce those people in due course. So as I say, Kelly will lead this session. We will pause at several points to check in on questions, which I will monitor along with the tech team from Australian Progress and Essential Media. And I noticed we have some people from Aotearoa. Very lovely to have people beyond Australia joining us. It's fabulous. So with that, I think, Kelly, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Anita, and hi everyone. It's lovely to be connected with you today over the virtual world. So many gorgeous faces looking back at me. And hi Emma. Emma Hurd is going to be with me today to talk about this topic, about how climate action can help us move forward as we recover from COVID-19. And it's really great actually that Emma, being an incredible leader within the business world, both through her role in the IGCC, but in her previous leadership roles on climate change and in businesses like Westpac, to have that business nous come together with the concept around climate change and the community organisations like ACF. This time is probably more important time than ever for business, community and governments to be working together, to challenge each other, because we've got some big challenges, but to work together. So I'm especially pleased to be here today with Emma, and just wanted to check in with you, Emma, before we go on, how you're doing there and where you're broadcasting from today.
Thanks, Kelly. It is a pleasure to be here as well. As you can see, I'm broadcasting from my front room like everybody else. And I'm based in Sydney at the moment, really looking forward to today's discussion. Really pleased to be here. And I think it should be a really rich and interesting discussion as well. So I'll hand straight back to you so we can get straight back into it.
Okay. I'm broadcasting from my kitchen table, like many of you. So what we want to talk about in the session is to really start out by saying, what is it that we want to actually see in this moment? Then to talk about how do we make it happen? So what are the practical solutions that we have to put forward today? And how does that help make our country better? And finish by talking about the choice that we have really over the coming few months as we hopefully move out of this pandemic and rebuild our nation, our economy, our well-being, our society. How important is it that we solve the climate crisis throughout that time? And what happens if we don't, and what does that mean for all of us? So as Anita has mentioned, we've got a couple of guests joining us today, so I won't go back through that, but I did just want to take a note that we had all had a bit of a conversation, and we wanted to be really clear that we are talking about something today that is going to take up our thinking and our time over the coming months. But today, tomorrow is all about the health and well-being of the people that we love, and our fellow Australians and our fellow citizens across the world. And whilst we are talking about ways that we can make our future better, we also didn't want that to be seen as being opportunistic about this terrible moment that we are in. And our hearts go out to everyone that's affected. People on this call are affected. There is a way that we can rebuild our nation that solves a number of crises at one time, and that's what we wanted to talk about today. So I'll just kick it off by talking about what we want to see, and I'll check in on questions that you might have throughout those three sort of segments that we've got. So thinking about COVID-19 and climate change, you'd be thinking they don't have a whole lot in common, right? But they do at this moment tell us how important It is to have a resilient economy, to have reliable jobs. As soon as we have shut that economy down, industries have ceased to operate, we've lost our jobs, and businesses are at real threat. So that is the same risk that we face, of course, under climate change, unless we change the way our economy operates, the businesses that flourish, the jobs we have. So they have that in common. And the other thing that they have in common is that the health and well-being of humans, us, is dependent on nature. I think we're seeing that. And unfortunately, we have for many, many decades now pitted the economy against the environment, and we're even starting to hear a little bit about that from some businesses that will want to flourish and burn more, frack more, log more, cut things down, moving forward in the name of economic development and jobs. But if a healthy environment underpins a healthy economy, you can either have both those things or you can have neither of those things. So we need to be making sure that we are investing as much in solving the climate crisis as we move forward, as we are in reshaping and rebuilding our economy, kickstarting it again after the COVID crisis passes us. So it is our mission, and I loved the webinar that was last week that Sam Mostyn and Travis McLeod led. And Sam talked about the difference between bouncing back from this moment and bouncing forward. And I love the notion of bouncing forward and the idea that she was talking about having a mission, a plan, and a huge overwhelming force of people from across business, from across community, to actually make it our mission to bounce forward in this country in a way that solves the climate crisis and helps our economy rebuild after this. And I think that, towards the end, we're going to be talking about who's in on this biggest campaign probably in our time, because this will be a contest of ideas. The contest has already started, and we have a history of destroying our natural world in order to pursue economic development. But what we know is that you have both of those things. You have both a healthy economy and a healthy environment, or you have neither. Because if we do not solve this climate crisis, it will have vast economic damage on our country. We all know that. I just wanted to quickly share a couple of photos with you so that we remember that the climate crisis is still here with us. And I know that you know this, but it was not so long ago that we were fighting terrible bushfires. Seems like a long time ago now, unless you're in one of those communities that still can't go home, or one of the industries that still can't operate because of the fires. But it wasn't so long ago that we were fighting these terrible fires, and that people were simply trying to protect their home and protect their livelihoods. And so was nature. So nature, much of it was left without a home after the bushfires. I particularly love this photo. I don't know why. I find it devastating and inspirational all at once. But, there has been damage done, damage that is fueled by climate change. And we have that crisis, and that crisis unfolded before our eyes this summer. So much like a pandemic, climate change happens slowly and then quickly, because we are starting to much more rapidly experience the impacts that climate damage has on all our lives. It's not just the fires, it's of course the Darling River, the amount of water that we're taking out of those rivers and that they can no longer support because there's less water in those rivers because of climate change. The terrible drought that we are experiencing in this country, the third bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef that we are experiencing right now. Depressing, and sorry about that. And at the end, if you can hang in there, I hope to just help us for a little moment imagine what we love about this country and what's worth saving in this country and why we need to really step up. So the climate crisis is not going away, it is still here. But there are a gazillion studies, slight exaggeration there, but quite a lot of studies that have shown that we can make our country rich in jobs, our country rich in industries, our country rich in clean and plentiful air and water, and in spirit and in the future for our children, if we actually tackle the climate crisis. It is highly irresponsible of some journalist outfits to actually be using COVID to show what acting on climate change looks like going forward. It looks nothing like what we're experiencing. It looks like jobs for a lot more people than we have experienced over the history of our country. It looks like new industries and new opportunities for this country. Solving climate, we talk about climate change as a loss, solving climate change as a loss in this country, and it's just wrong. It's the wrong mindset to have, because we can be rich in all different ways if we actually tackle this problem. But what it means we need to do really fast, and we believe in particular coming out of this crisis that we need to be shifting government subsidies from fossil fuels to clean energy infrastructure, to build wind and solar plants and farms around the country, to put solar panels on CFA sheds, to help schools be energy efficient, to build storage batteries and help farmers store carbon in their soil, help communities, for example, that are dependent on aluminium, continue to have their jobs by building aluminium smelters off clean energy, to support the communities actually that are likely to be the most disrupted from climate change and from the industry change that needs to happen. They're communities like the Latrobe Valley, the Hunter Valley, Collie, Geraldton, Gladstone, Port Augusta. It's actually these communities that if we tackle the climate crisis and we choose to solve the problems and real solutions that can solve the problems, these communities can actually benefit from the types of economies and industries that we can grow. We can grow new markets. ACF and ACTU did a report a couple of years ago and a few years before that and a few years before that that showed that there's 1 million new jobs if we solve the climate crisis, and we are going to be needing those jobs moving forward. So this is our opportunity to bounce forward as a country, not bounce back. And it is an important role for government, but it's also a very important role for business to be investing in this future. And I'd like to hand over to Emma for some time to have a talk about what she's seen as an opportunity for that economic recovery of our nation, for solutions for climate change, and in particular where she sees the role of government and business in that.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly, and thanks very much for that really good framing for the discussion that we look to have in terms of bringing together some of those the threads of recent history, the ongoing issue that we know we have, the crisis that we're in right now, and then also allowing us that space to look forward and actually think about, well, this is a window where we should and we must be having that conversation around what kind of a recovery that we actually want to have. And I'm really pleased to be joining the discussion today as well, to have that focus on solutions and to take the time, as is entirely appropriate right now, even in the midst of this health crisis, to begin thinking about and looking ahead in terms of what kinds of solutions we should be thinking about. I guess so just in case for those of you who've joined the call today, joined the town hall today, who aren't as familiar with our work. So we're an industry association that's been around for 15 years. In fact, this year, 15 years. We were actually set up by 10 founding institutional investors themselves. So these are the large super funds, infrastructure investors, the big long-term investors, the big asset owners, the pension funds, the super funds, who have a slightly different view across the finance sector as many other elements of the finance sector does. These are the long-term investors who hold very big assets across our economy and our community, and who also have the responsibility and are charged with the legal obligation of looking after our retirement savings. So when we put our money in, we need to know that in 35, 40 years, it'll be returned to us to allow us to enjoy our retirement with dignity and to support the life as we live it, no matter what part of the economy or what part of society you actually live in. It's actually a huge resource for Australia as well, our retirement savings. but as we've also seen in the last few weeks, this industry has been just as much impacted by the events of the last few months as well. We've seen, office people sent home to work. We've seen huge impacts in terms of the financial markets. I don't know whether any of you have been brave enough to look at your super savings account in the last couple of weeks. I do not recommend it. I think give it some time, come back to it in a few months' time, but it's pretty ugly out there, that's for sure. And then we're also seeing a pretty active debate right now about how does the super sector and how does the investor community play a role in the immediate short term in terms of helping people through jobs and their economic insecurity issues. But also, I think what would be good to focus on today is what's the role of the sector in contributing towards Australia's recovery, our economic recovery, our community and social recovery after the health crisis that we've been through and the necessary steps that we've taken to really contain it. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So for us, for IGCC, our goal remains unchanged. If you'd asked me at the beginning of the year and you're asking me today, you ask me in the next few years, I'll say the same thing. Our goal is a climate resilient net zero emissions Australia. So that means both that we are, investing in protecting ourselves to the effects of climate change that we're already seeing, which is the resilience, but also that we're really thinking hard about what we need to do across our business community, across our investment practices, how we allocate money in terms of actually moving ourselves into a net zero emissions economy as well. We know that the reason we think this is so important is not only because, we support Paris, because we're strongly aligned with it, not only because it's about managing climate change as a systemic financial risk for the Australian economy. We are a very trade exposed and carbon intensive economy. All of our retirement savings is exposed to that. So we have that obligation to be managing for it. But also because we know that it's a ratcheting risk. We know that climate change will continue to increase in terms of the impacts it has for all of us. And unfortunately, we've seen that particularly in the last 6 months, 12 months, last few years in terms of the impacts, the kinds of impacts that Kelly also outlined. So, business finance has to be part of a solution. We have to be playing our part in terms of actually helping to transition the economy as well. Which is, I guess what I'm kind of saying here in terms of those two threads is that, the finance sector, the investor community, the business community has been hit pretty hard by our response to COVID, but it also knows that it's got a serious obligation to help be part of the solution in terms of bounce forward, as we talked about. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we have to acknowledge that climate change is a key part of our risks as well. So some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of the role of climate change as a threat multiplier. Like if you think about, if we were going through this right now, if this was happening in January, at the same time that we were going through the bushfires, what would actually Australia's capacity have been to respond to both of those crises? And the more we invest in activities which continue to grow the impacts of climate change, the more of these kind of multiple threats that we are likely to potentially see. So I guess that's the horror scenario, not just one global crisis unfolding, but also the real effects of the other global crisis that's unfolding happening all at once for Australia. How do we deal with that? In terms of our communities, in terms of our homes, in terms of our nature and our ecosystems, but also our energy infrastructure, our water infrastructure, in terms of our ability to have Zoom hookups when we've also got, a lot of infrastructure under threat of the effects of climate change. So this is not an either or scenario. We actually need to be walking and chewing gum at the same time here. I also think that there's strong support and appetite within the investor community for climate change action. That hasn't gone away. That hasn't been shoved off the list of top 10 things that you need to do. It's probably just the situation that we're in right now changes the way we think about how we're going to respond to some of these issues in the immediate period. And if you think about this question around, what are we going to do over the next 6 to 12 months, 2 years, in terms of planning for a sustainable economy, sustainable recovery for our economy, then where are the real opportunities in which we can think about some of these issues that we've been dealing with around resilience, around decarbonisation, around future-proofing our communities and our economies, and really begin to bring together some solutions in terms of how we invest, where and how, and with who, in terms of allocating investment and capital into climate change solutions as well. So I think it's really great to have Anna, who'll be talking about their report. It's really great to have Patrick, who'll be talking about the global context. I think in that sense, there's a lot of different issues that we can unpack from the business community. you know, I don't claim to speak for all aspects of the business community, nor would I want to. I guess I'm more here to provide that perspective around how do we have a joined up conversation here about doing what's best for Australia at a time when we're all going through the situation, and we're all looking at what sorts of things we should be doing to really invest in solutions as well. So I'm happy to pause there and hand back to you, Kelly.
Yeah, I'm so sort of both terrified and glad that you brought up that example of if this had happened a few months ago and we're dealing with a bushfire crisis and not being able to be near each other.
Yeah.
And I'm, you know, really worried about what is going to happen if the next bushfire season repeats like the last one and starts in winter again.
Mm-hmm.
And so that notion that climate change makes everything worse, that's a risk amplifier, is such an important reason why we need to solve this problem. I, rather than just go into questions right now, I'm just going to bring Anna in, because Anna is the CEO of Climate Works Australia and has just released on Saturday a report that looks at how you move our country towards decarbonisation, sharing the goals that Emma has spoken about, that ACF holds, of getting us to net zero or no net pollution levels quickly, and at least by mid-century. Anna's looked particularly at domestic carbon pathways. I know there's a few questions about exports as well, and we can answer those a bit later. So welcome, Anna. Tell us a little bit about your new report.
Thanks, Kelly and Emma, and hi, everyone. Yes, hot off the press, although 2 years in the making. So Climate Works has updated work that we did back in 2014, which looks at what are the technology pathways that are available in Australia to keep our emissions under the carbon budget that the science says we need to stay under 2 degrees. And also this time we added a scenario for the more ambitious goal of staying under 1.5 degrees. And the good news is we found both are still available to us within Australia. We have lost time, of course, in bringing emissions down in the last half decade, but we've gained time in the sense that technology performance has improved faster than our last work documented or predicted. So we then looked at if those technological improvements could continue, could we stay under those carbon budgets? We found the answer was yes. There are technologies that are already invented and mature mostly. And the issue then is, can we make sure that we deploy them widely enough across all the sectors? So in the 5 minutes that I've got with you, I'll just walk through the 5 sectors that we studied: buildings, industry, transport, electricity and agriculture. And what are the technologies that are available in each of those sectors? And the relevance for a stimulus recovery discussion is that because we found that actually most of the technologies already exist, it's just about using them more and making sure that when we upgrade, that we can upgrade technologies faster than we might otherwise, that when we upgrade, we don't forget to use the best practice zero emissions one, and we don't forget and just use what we, replace it with the old version. It's about being proactive at every moment of technology and equipment upgrade. That turns out to be something that's very stimulus friendly. That actually, when you're looking at kickstarting an economy, bringing forward investment, that's something that's available, that can be installed and can bring energy cost savings in right away, is something that we think is very aligned to the goals that governments will be looking at in the next few months. And indeed, will help us achieve 2 goals at one time. And as Kelly has talked about, respond to both crises in parallel. And the last reflection in opening, looking at some of the questions around analogies with the post-war reconstruction, what's the economy we want to rebuild? We have mapped this across the economy, and the message that Emma and Kelly have conveyed is that decarbonisation of the economy doesn't necessarily mean major change to our lifestyle or the way that we live and work and interact together. It's about changing the energy sources and removing the pollution from the production of the services and products that we use. And what we found is there are technologies that can do that. So we don't need to use this current period as an analogy for what solving climate change looks like. It's not about shutting things down or stopping travel. It's about using cleaner fuels in travel, for example. So the other reflection is, can it be done in the time that we've got? And when we first did this work 5 years ago, we actually did the maths on 2050, how far away is it? And we used an analogy which I'd forgotten about until this week. And we said it was about the same number of years as from 1933 to 1969. And we picked those years because the maths was the same, but also the period. 1933 was the height of the Great Depression. We said, imagine sitting in a boardroom or a lounge room in 1933 after the years that you would have just endured, the years of hardship and economic slowdown. And imagine if someone had said to you, in 33 years, there'll be a man on the moon. What we have found today is that in less than 33 years, we can remove net emissions from our economy. And it's not about inventing a rocket that we haven't invented yet. It's actually about using technology that's already there. So let's jump in with that context and what are these technologies? And I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully this will work. Oh no, that's disabled. Okay. I will just talk to the slides and have them shared. It's available all on our website anyway. All that I wanted to cover with you is these sector studies that we've, the sector analysis. The context is that we've studied getting to net zero emissions by 2050. Emma has talked about already the investors in her circles are making those commitments. So have all the state governments in Australia. It's fast becoming the norm. We found two key themes of our work was to accelerate deployment of mature and demonstrated technologies and pull through the R&D on the emerging so that we can accelerate those deployments in the decade after. So the coming decade matters for getting what's off the shelf available into the market and pulling through what needs to be ready to be into the market the decade after. How can this help respond to the COVID-19 pandemic? It can create jobs in sustainable industries and increase Australia's economic resilience and set ourselves up for the future economic growth to prepare for products and services that a zero emissions economy will demand. It also can decrease the energy costs and improve health outcomes when we eliminate those sources of pollution. So we found, half a dozen very readily deployable solutions that we felt were stimulus aligned, and that includes upgrades to existing residential and commercial buildings, the full suite of energy efficiency, electrification, solar PV measures. Secondly, accelerated deployment of large-scale renewables and storage. Thirdly, construction of charging stations to support electric vehicle rollout. Fourthly, nature-based solutions, including carbon forestry, both silvopasture, so integrated with farming, and dedicated at scale plantation work. And fifth, circular economy measures, so increased recycling, increased localised supply chain. They are some of the measures we plucked from the analysis that we feel are very ready for highlighting. I'll talk you through now the full suite.
Anna,
yeah.
Sorry, it's Anita here. You should be able to share your screen now if you want.
Okay, I'll try that.
Sorry to interrupt.
No worries. Let's see if this works. Okay.
There you go. Thanks.
So this is a little highlight of why do we have confidence in this? Some of these technologies were not even in our last roadmap done in 2014, and some have improved faster than predicted. So renewables was not then the standout cheaper technology. It was on equal par with a mix that had coal and CCS or a mix that had nuclear in it. Now it is clearly cheaper than new fossil fuel generation, even after allowing for hours of storage. And that's partly because you'll see their battery costs are 1/5 the cost of what they were 10 years ago. Construction, we've seen steel has been replaced by timber. For example, 10-storey building in Brisbane already using cross-laminated timber. Electric vehicles now mature, 3 million around the world. Beyond that, we've seen electric ferries now making their maiden journeys. And you'll see their electric planes are already in flight. True, they're at small scale at the moment, 1 and 2 people, but they were not even on the table 5 or 6 years ago when we published this last work. And then we looked at the agriculture sector, and obviously there are the meat substitutes. The share price of Beyond Meat, for one example, grew 700% 3 months after they launched. So there is a lot more in the emerging that could indeed reduce emissions further. But we wanted to show how fast technological improvements have occurred when deployment and consumer demand has worked together.
And I'm not sure we're going to have time to go through each deeply, but it'd be great to look at those 5 industries you've looked at, and also your thinking. I know you haven't done the analysis this time around on what it might look at, what the economy might look at like after this, but you have done it before. I'd be interested in your view about if we did these things, what you think jobs and industries in our economy would look like going forward.
Yes. When we did this last time, we found that GDP growth was almost identical to the business as usual pathway. In one analysis, by 2050, in the business as usual pathway compared to the decarbonised pathway, you got to the same GDP 2 years later. So 2048, 2 years later, 2050, we got to the same GDP. What we found this time around is that the technology costs have fallen, and that we can in fact eliminate more emissions before needing to do offsets with carbon forestry than we could previously. So if anything, that economic story should have gotten more positive. But the reason we didn't rerun the economic analysis is actually the business as usual pathway has potentially gotten more negative. That we can see now what climate change impacts can do to the economy, as through the bushfires you were talking about this summer. Yet mainstream economic modelling has not yet been able to incorporate all of those impacts into the standard economic tools. And so we felt that it was actually too difficult to do a comparison of, well, what if we didn't act on climate? That the business as usual pathway wasn't a reasonable comparison. And so we have not combined it with the economic modelling this time around. There's one slide that summarises all the 5 sectors, if that's helpful. Great. And I won't go through all 5 together, but I'll flick through them if this works. I don't know how this, I don't think that's going to work on the screen sharing. It's frozen on this because I'm not the driver, but I'll share across each of the 5 in building, and I'll say the 5 again. We've looked at buildings, transport, electricity, industry and agriculture. Electricity is often considered the lead sector, where we know we can get, in the next 10 years, our research shows we can get to 3/4 decarbonised grid. So around 75% renewables in the grid in 10 years. And we do that largely through large-scale solar thermal as well, bringing in storage. That then enables almost complete decarbonisation of the building sector through more electrification, as well as improved demand management, energy efficiency across buildings. And it enables a lot of decarbonisation in the transport sector. But interesting, transport is slower. The next decade, you've got to paddle hard just to stay flat in terms of emissions because of the pace at which vehicle fleets turn over, and then the curve starts coming down. But electrification is core to the solutions in transport, and hydrogen and fuel cells start to do the job of the longer haul. Short haul is largely solved by electricity now, and longer haul we're looking to hydrogen and fuel cells. For industry, it's more of a mixed bag, but there are still many mature solutions available, electrification being one of them. For example, conveyor belts on mine sites replacing diesel trucks, solar generators replacing diesel generators. They are in operation today in Australian mines. But there are also some emerging and demonstration technologies that we need to pull through at greater scale. And without an incentive for that or support for that, it isn't happening at the pace that we know the technologies could do the job for us. And finally, in agriculture, there's some fascinating technologies. For example, Australia's livestock emissions could be halved if the vaccine that's already been proven to work in lowering the methane that cattle burp out, we know that that can work. But the question, what's the business model? How do you get it into every cow? So there's some experimentation going on around using drones for that potentially. And if that can be found to be commercially acceptable, 40 megatons of abatement could occur in the next decade, per annum that would be, so halving. And then you'd still need to look at plant-based substitutes, energy efficient farm equipment, go electrification instead of diesel, and do carbon forestry to absorb the remainder. That's not a permanent solution. We saw what happened to forests over the summer, but it is a solution that buys us time to then spend the later decade or two, sort of the 2040s, solving the last bit of the residual.
So everyone, there are very practical solutions that we can do right now that have been extensively researched and looked at, that many of which are shovel ready, as the terminology goes, that we can put in place as a solution to regrow, rebound our economy, grow jobs, grow new industries. Anna's report can be found on their website, Climate Works Australia. And thank you very much, Anna, for that overview. Really appreciate it. I thought I would just check in with Anisha before we hear from Patrick about how he feels governments might respond to this. See if you've got any questions, and then we will talk about this moment and how we all need to lead into this and what it means for us if we are going to win this contest of ideas.
Right.
Anita, any questions?
Yes, there are lots of questions. I've tried to put them into themes, and so maybe I'll give you all of them and then people can answer them. That way we can manage our
We're only about to do a few, so what's the time?
Sure, so I'm putting them into, there are some questions around parallels. So for example, Osman's asking whether there's a parallel here to think about how we did post-war construction as a way of rebuilding things. There's a question from Elaine about whether or not the new trust in science around COVID will have implications for trusting climate science more, and whether this could be a tipping point in the same way that the fires were for the environment. Then there are some questions around how to best secure change. So how to get the government to act on these things, how will we get the government to become serious about climate action post-COVID, and whether there's any way of doing this without dismantling neoliberal policies, and what's the role of community groups. So there's a cluster of questions there around how to get change. A few people have pointed out a risk around the money that the government is putting into COVID that will put us into a substantial deficit. And will that mean there's less money for climate action and or a desire to keep exporting coal? And around solutions, there were some questions around whether there's a decarbonisation strategy that deals with both internal and exported carbon emissions, whether or not this crisis will help us bring the climate wars to a close because of this sense of like unity.
That would be good. That would be good. Yeah.
So maybe I'll just leave you those ones as a start.
Hardly anything there. Emma and I will try and touch on some of those. But I think that one thing I'm pointing at Emma here, that is really clear is that the role of private money is going to be critically important, because whoever did ask, is there going to be a lot less money for government on post this crisis? Well, I think so. And whilst climate change and concern about nature has really catapulted up the charts of concern for Australians, to get to number one, actually, just as this pandemic hit, there probably is going to be a lot less money from governments to invest. I think that humans do what they know, adventure and trying new things and creating new markets is not something that everyone, and I think in particular in Canberra, it seems to hit a little bit harder there, that they're not always as bold as others. So we are going to have to work very hard to push this forward. It is an opportunity for domestic transformation and transformation of our exports industry. It's an opportunity for local manufacturing, local food production, huge value add, everything that sort of Ross Garnaut says in his work. And I think the idea around the parallels and the trust in science, maybe even big government is back after these issues. Certainly the role of government in our economy is pretty strong at the moment. It is a choice, and we're going to talk about that next. But right now, whether it's a tipping point or not depends on the choices that are made. But what we do know is time matters for climate change. But before we just go over to Patrick, we've just had really practical things that can be done next from Anna, in terms of actual solutions that are ready to go. And I'd love to just hear from Emma now about what do you see businesses could do in the next 12 months to really invest in reshaping that our economy, our jobs and industries towards cleanliness and things that are good for the people and places we live.
Cleanliness being next to goodliness. Look, there was some really, I've been watching the chat stream as various people have been talking, and there are some really interesting observations and comments coming through as well. Just to pick up on a couple of them, the parallels with other major points in time and history where we were shocked out of BAU and we had a choice to do something deliberative, and what we chose to do then had repercussions for decades, I think is a really key one. And I think there's a lot of awareness around that. Not a lot of certainty as to what we will do or how that will play out, but certainly, you know, not just in Australia, but in so many markets in so many ways, like geopolitically, economically, community-based relations, in so many ways, this is a real shock to the system, and it's almost you can almost see everyone trying to grapple with the different ways in which it's playing out. But there's no doubt that this is a time where things will be disrupted. Even more than they were already being disrupted. I really like the observation that that when it really comes down to it, we do trust science, that we have listened to science, and also that we do trust the public service as well, that we have listened to the public service and the public announcement. We have actively looked for them, even at a time when you know, community trust levels in government at an all-time low. We have looked to governments and looked to our public authorities to actually guide us in terms of what to do, and we've responded. For the most part, a few incidences involving beaches aside, for the most part, we've actually responded in terms of trusting in our institutions during this period. And hopefully, I think that will also help to revisit the question of why don't we trust them in other key areas of our community debate, or what are the factors that are driving or influencing that level of distrust, because it's not all by accident, as we know. The other couple of points, you know, the implications for political systems and political structures. I mean, I think that will take time to play out. Is it the death of neoliberalism? Is that the most important question right now? Has it been sort of on evolving and mutating for a number of years now? You know, have we actually, is this an opportunity to actually rethink all of our roles in a public discussion on issues of global importance? You know, I think these are all really live and active questions at the moment, and it's appropriate that we are scrutinising our response, and it's appropriate that we are also applying accountability and questions of accountability to not just governments, but also to business and to community and to all of us as individual citizens in terms of what we're doing in response to these sorts of situations. Well, to the circumstances that we're in specifically. A couple of comments I want to make and pick up on some of Anna's work. I always get very excited when ClimateWorks put out one of their epic decarbonisation pathways reports, because there's so much in there that basically you can spend another 2 years unpacking it all in terms of the implications from my perspective, for asset classes, for companies, for technologies, for opportunities in decarbonisation specifically. So I think we'll be diving through it and talking about it in a lot more detail. I guess in terms of just pivoting between that and what we would potentially need for the sustainable recovery of Australia's economy, how do we bring together some of those threads of the conversation in a constructive way? So we would expect that, you know, the question that we were focusing on post bushfires around resilience to the physical effects of climate change has now taken on a more somber dimension around resilience to other global issues. But a lot of the solutions and the responses are quite aligned. It is around stress testing our financial system to shocks. It is around business continuity planning. It is around planning ahead for the major events and not just relying upon short-termism in the way that we run our economies. There are a lot of parallels there, and we shouldn't just switch off one and switch on the new one. We should be thinking about resilience to the effects of climate change and bushfires, for example, and other global social and health issues concurrently, and we should be fixing for both. We know that in terms of government spend, governments will have no money. So, you know, where is the money going to come from? Private sector is not going to have a lot of money for the next little while as well. So we're going to have to work together in order to invest in economic recovery. Where will we do that? Infrastructure and construction always seems to be useful areas, both areas where there is a lot of momentum around emissions reduction activities, a lot of opportunities, as Anna has said. Property sector, there's a huge amount of interest in net zero property portfolios and technology opportunities there. Why can't we do both? In terms of energy generation, transmission, distribution, consumption, in terms of power purchasing agreements, in terms of household use and household technology solutions. On all of those fronts, there are opportunities for co-investment and collaboration between the private sector and government around moving forward in a constructive way, bouncing forward. And some of that can be just as simple in terms of grants to business or some sort of co-funding or investment for business in terms of kickstarting CapEx and OpEx investment. You know, a lot of businesses are saying, I've had no revenue for 6 months of the year. I'm not going to spend a cent on anything. Well, if there's a way that government can come in and say, well, if you spend it on these activities, then we can potentially partner there in terms of getting a more sustainable outcome and getting some jobs and capital flowing as well. Which is, of course, my way of leading into, we will naturally see rent seeking. You know, that is the great Australian way, the great global business way. You know, that will happen. We need to be alive to it. We need to be making sure that we are co-investing in the areas where we should be and not just throwing good money after bad and subsidising the companies or the industries that weren't viable, aren't viable, and that aren't contributing to even more of the problems that we will face when we restore, and actually looking at ways to pull along some of those companies or potential opportunities down the transition pathway. It is a complicated discussion. You know, scrutiny is important, but flexibility will also be a little bit important there as well. And I guess the last point I want to make is just to pick up on one of the comments that someone made on the chat thread, which is what's also going to be really interesting to see is changed behaviour. I was talking to someone the other day who was saying that they'd spent 2 years contemplating a shift in allowing their workforce to go completely offline in terms of trading financial markets, but they're worried about regulatory issues and systems issues, and they'd costed it up, and it would take 3 months and it was too expensive, and then they managed to do the whole thing in 3 days when they had to. And immediately you've seen this embracing of changed priorities and changed behaviour as well. And I think one of the most fascinating things to watch will be, that's the X factor, the unknown factor in many ways. How have we all changed? And how will that change our expectations for business as consumers, for governments, for our political leaders, for our civil society leaders? You know, will we expect much more? I think we will. And I think that will be the factor that will also help to drive so much of the kinds of positive outcomes that we're also looking for.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that. And I kind of couldn't agree more that we're going to have to be looking for massive multiple outputs and outcomes from any form of idea, policy, investment going forward, because there is a lot of money being spent on keeping people healthy and well right now, as it should, and credit where credit is due to our governments for their strong leadership on that. It is going to just make it harder to free up the type of money that we need going forward. But we always think about trade-offs. I reckon we'd love to lock people in a room and say, you're not allowed out before you come up with a win-win-win situation. I know this trade-off business, and I've sat around policy tables inside government and business tables as well, and as well as the not-for-profit movement. I think we should lock us all together and force us to come up with an outcome, because I'm sure it's possible. I wanted to just quickly throw to Patrick. We've only got a minute or so. Patrick, just give you a bit of a heads up. I'm about to do that. Patrick was the ambassador for Environment for Australia, which is the coolest sounding title ever, and joins us now. He's no longer in that role, and he's in a role at Pollinate. But just a minute from you, Patrick, on how you feel our governments could respond to this, and how you feel governments around the world may respond to that. In a minute, you'll be able to do that, no problems.
Can you hear me? Because I've been having some trouble with my...
Gotcha.
Okay. All right, just in a minute. Well, I suspect governments will deal with this the way they've been dealing with climate change the whole time. You'll have some progressive governments and you'll have some less progressive governments, and the arguments will continue to have to be made across the spectrum. So, for example, you see the EU already signalling that their stimulus packages will be consistent with their Green Deal commitments. In the US, you saw a huge fight in Congress with Democrats trying to put some of that into the stimulus package there, and with not much success. New Zealand is moving more with the European Union, and so I suspect that dynamic will continue to play out across the world. I mean, obviously, initially the urgent focus and the main focus of governments everywhere will be the virus itself and helping save lives. And so, in a sense, there's an element of sensitivity which I am seeing internationally in debate around this as to how hard climate change should be being pushed at this moment. But at the same time, we know all governments need to be thinking about where they go next from a policy perspective, and that is on recovery as we emerge from this crisis, and what are the policy options to be taken coming out of this dreadful crisis that we're in at the moment. And I think in that sense, continuing to make the case, as Anna's excellent work that she's just gone through is going to be really important for governments, because the thing to persuade governments around the world still is the economics around climate action, as well as climate action for its own sake. And I think one of the most interesting aspects, which probably got lost a bit in the Australian summer for us because of the bushfires, was even in the last 6 to 9 months, how much was moving, and how much faster things were moving on the climate change agenda globally. And you had the September summit at the United Nations last year, where the whole focus was on moving from negotiations, because we've pretty much done and dusted all of the Paris Agreement negotiations, to action, implementation, and ambition. And so governments were getting onto that sort of narrative, but it seems more importantly to me was what companies were doing. And I do think we missed a bit of this over the Australian summer, but looking at the announcements by BlackRock, by State Street, by BP, by Rio Tinto, by Microsoft, by company after company after company in the private sector world, which many of you said is so important for driving progress, simply looking at the economics. And I think the BlackRock one summarizes it best. They spent a whole year doing extraordinarily sophisticated number crunching across the United States, state by state, industry by industry, utility by utility, essentially to show empirically to their investment boards that investing in climate resilient, climate solutions was a better investment bet in terms of the returns. And the minute they saw that and proved that from a database perspective, then they started moving in terms of their public positioning. So they've gone to a very, very sophisticated, they're emphasizing sustainability a lot more, particularly with their asset managers, which is $7 trillion worth of weight now in the financial system. There's 23 trillion dollars of that type of money being managed by asset managers around the world. And the minute BlackRock moved, then State Street moved, and others will be moving. So I think, when the governments are looking around for jobs and growth, which will all be they're looking at. I mean, I was with Kevin Rudd during the global financial crisis. It's jobs and growth that we want. Where are the strongest areas for jobs and growth? And everything that you've just outlined now, and the experience of BlackRock and other companies around the world, are suggesting that the areas for biggest growth and most jobs coincide with lower emissions, climate resilient economic trajectories. And so making that case consistently and continually to government from now by all sorts of different groups, including Pollination, who I'm working with, but Anna and Emma and everyone on this call, I think is an important part of the way to influence government to help design their stimulus packages when recovery is the major focus, to those areas of growth and jobs that you've all talked about. And I think that given the private sector is increasingly moving in that direction on the basis of the economics, and government seeing that, is a very, very strong lever and a very strong indicator that the economics is turning in favour of it, and therefore the arguments should become more persuasive to governments, but we've got to keep making them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Patrick. And so we're saying that now is the time to lean into an opportunity to protect our climate, to protect our children's future, to lower our electricity bills, to build new markets, to protect our forests and help them suck carbon out of the atmosphere rather than cutting them down. And I'm getting the wind up, so I will just finish by saying that what we do today, tomorrow, over the next month, over the next 6 months on this is possibly one of the biggest pivotal moments that certainly in the environment movement I can think of, because if we get this right and we rebuild our economy and we push that economy forward, we bounce our country forward and make it a better place for everyone, it stacks up. It stacks up economically, it stacks up for society and for communities, for the people that we love. It certainly will stack up for nature, and we are so dependent on nature. But it is going to be very hard to do. As a full-time environmentalist, I can tell you solving climate change is bloody hard. And you've got to overcome the economics, as Patrick just mentioned, and we have largely, but politics. We've got to make sure that they're popular sentiments among communities. So changing the hearts and minds is our job. And so this is going to take us all. It's going to take government, it's going to take business, it's going to take environment groups leaning into this, civil society groups, unions, all leaning into this one moment and saying that we can build this country back better, because there are already folks out in the world that are advocating to lift regulations, to lift employee benefits, to dig up more, to frack more, to ship more as a solution to this problem. But we know it will only make the problem far worse for us going forward. So if I gave you a whole lot of pictures at the start of this that are a little bit depressing, can I just ask you to think for 10 seconds, because that's all I've got left before we go back to Anita, and just think about the place that you love most in the world, the Australian place that you love most in the world, and the people that you love most in the world. And that is what we need to be fighting for over the coming weeks and months in order to make sure that coming out of this horrific pandemic, we can build climate solutions that will make the country a much better place. And there's bloody good reason to do it. They're called the people that we have dinner with every night, and the beautiful national parks and beaches that we go and visit, not right now, but into the future. Thank you so much for your time, for our incredible speakers, and particularly Emma, for being with us today, and a wonderful person that I've known for a long time. And actually, I didn't say it, but Emma and I were together the day the carbon price was axed. And we went to the pub together, because there's a lot more that unites us than divides us, as we found out. And thank you very much to the organisers of today for allowing us to have this conversation. I will now pass back to Anita.
Thank you so much. It just remains for me to say thank you to all the speakers and for all the work that you've been doing and continue to do for creating the future that we all want. I think we're all going away with the bouncing forward, not bouncing back, and that this is a future worth fighting for. So I want to thank you all very much. And for all the participants, thank you for your questions. I know we never have enough time to get to all of them, but I'm hoping that through the various discussions, you had some parts of those questions that you had answered. And of course, this is a conversation that we can't do in just 1 hour. So I'd encourage you all to keep being part of the conversation through your organisations and through the connections and relationships that you build with each other through this forum and outside of it. And if you found today good food for thought and uplifting, I recommend keeping in touch with all the lunchtime sessions that are coming out through Australians at Home. Tomorrow is a political geek fest with Peter Lewis and Catherine Murphy. I'm sure many of you will love that as well. There'll also be a feedback survey for you from today. But if you sign up for the mailing list, you'll get alerts for all the events. And every day is a fascinating panel of speakers like today. So no shortage of food for thought and hope. So thank you again today to all the speakers and to Essential and Principal Co who initiated this, and all the collaborating organisations, including Australian Progress, The Guardian and Community Council Australia. Have a great day, everyone. See you.
Bye.
Bye.